So there I was, standing in front of a room of people who had it in for me. Their boss had just asked me to defend my qualitative research and to persuade him that it was trustworthy. And after a moment of being dumbstruck, I'd worked out an answer for him in a flash of insight. "I'm assuming that's coffee you're drinking," I said, pointing to a cup sitting next to a folder where he'd been writing some notes. "Yes," he said. "I'm assuming that's coffee you got from the machine in the break room just around the corner?" I asked. He frowned. "What does that have to do with the question that I just asked you?" "Everything," I said, feeling my pulse start to race as my blood returned to my face. And I smiled. "Let me tell you something about that coffee." Well, in our previous lecture, we talked about some of the guiding philosophies behind how the scientific method is applied. We hadn't quite reached a point where we could differentiate between quantitative and qualitative research. In our positivist hierarchy, we can see that we generally think of quantitative research in methods like experimental and statistical methods, and they provide a higher class of evidence than what we typically think of as qualitative research, which were the comparative analysis or case studies. But as you might expect, things aren't so simple as being able to say qualitative research provides a lower quality of data than quantitative research, or vice versa. And though there's been a lot of contention throughout the past over that very notion, it's not true. To put it simply, every field that conducts research has a certain historical bias towards qualitative or quantitative methods, and those biases carry over into the modern era in how both styles are taught. Now, I like to think that qualitative and quantitative research are both just kind of long-lost twins separated at birth. And they've recently found each other, and they've really begun to have a more familial relationship as a result of it. Quantitative research was raised in a household of very analytical, scientifically minded kind of people who like to measure things and conduct statistical analyses. And the quantitative research kid that I'm thinking of in this example tends to think about the world in very mathematical terms with an eye on predicting behaviors of groups of people. Qualitative research, on the other hand, he was raised in a household of very emotional people, hippies, who encourage participation in the fine arts and who like to talk out their feelings. He tends to think about the world in extremely individual, experiential terms, with an ear for hearing subtle variation in what people express about their lives. Quantitative research is ultimately derived from mathematics, and to truly understand the guiding philosophy behind quantitative-centric approaches, you really need to think like a mathematician for whom the truths about the universe around us can only really be demonstrated to be true if they can be represented in the form of a rigorous mathematical proof. One of the fields of mathematics that has contributed greatly to quantitative methods is the field of statistics, and from that, the hard sciences and social scientific fields, such as economics, geography, and demography, have all adopted many ideas and standards from which their work can be judged. Many of these fields are also the birthplaces of advanced statistical analytics that are common components of a marketing researcher's toolkit today. And I say this knowing that in the MMR program, you have learned many quantitative tools, probably more from the application side of things than from the theoretical side of things. Quite all right. That's how we all learn. Quantitative methods have been a tool for empirical research, but they have fallen in and out of fashion throughout the decades of the 20th and the 21st centuries, largely due to their complexity. In the early 20th century, quantitative research was really popular because it was being used to apply tools derived from new mathematics to provide analysis of complex systems such as manufacturing, distribution, social trends, and finance. And in the business world, which was really becoming numbers driven in that early 20th century due to an increased emphasis on production and scale, quantitative methods were extremely useful for optimizing output and reducing costs. At the social level, surveys were also quite popular because they could accumulate a large amount of simple information in a pretty efficient manner, and media companies, particularly magazines, used surveys routinely to collect information from large readerships and to target their focus and advertising more specifically. On the other side of social research were a series of what were often referred to as interpretive methods, and many scientists who were focused on quantitative methods felt that interpretive research had too much of a normative flavor to it. Remember, normative was that idea of this is the way things have always been. So in fact, many of the other words that are still used today to describe interpretive research, subjective, hermeneutic, introspective, directional, and postmodern, those are often used in a pejorative manner to describe qualitative research today. And I'm sure if you have conducted qualitative research, you've heard this kind of disdain for how qualitative research is viewed. But, the reason that we use qualitative research and marketing research is because of the fact that quantitative research doesn't really get all the answers, and it doesn't usually even get enough depth or detail to really understand things well. As the field of social science began to take root in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with what quantitative research could provide, and one of the driving fields of human research, which was psychology, really became much more interested in moving away from broad measurement of populations and into more personal clinical measurement. In fact, that's kind of where sociology and psychology split into different focuses. This meant incorporating more interpretive techniques which yielded deeper data and context than quantitative surveys ever could. And since these techniques were already being used by and refined by fields such as history, anthropology, sociology, and literary criticism, they carried with them a certain amount of intuitive credibility. Qualitative research also appealed greatly to consumer packaged goods manufacturers and to advertising agencies because the data were fairly easy to collect, they were really easy to understand, and because the stories that they could provide, the anecdotes they could provide, were often insightful and memorable. The researchers of the era were not called marketing researchers. Actually, they were called motivation researchers. And they tended to be formal social scientists, often with PhDs, with very contentious philosophies and preferred schools of thought, rather than marketers with training in formal research methods. So they differed quite a bit from what we refer to as marketing researchers today in their focus and in their training. Qualitative research was focused on using in-depth interviewing and projective techniques throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But as the 60s and 70s came around, they popularized a newer, more efficient method of qualitative research called the focus group. Focus groups became extremely popular for their ease of observation and scheduling. They allowed the business community to see research being performed live, and they resembled the more familiar format of meetings, where a consensus could be formed rather than the more unfamiliar and more nuanced format of an interview. In many ways, focus groups became qualitative marketing research because of their popularity and their familiarity to the corporate world. And they're sometimes referred to as the fast food of research methods as a result of that. Even today, focus groups are fashionable and problematic. And as we'll discuss later in this course, specifically when we focus on focus groups, they are an extremely contentious form of marketing research and require a lot of rigor to use properly for qualitative research. And I'm telling you this as someone that loves focus groups and that does focus groups. They can be very problematic. Now, quantitative research enjoyed a resurgence in the 1980s for marketing researchers as desktop computers and new software made quantitative analysis much easier to conduct. While quantitative research had traditionally been done by hand or by conducting very simple analyses using mainframe computers, desktop PCs made it easier to explore data sets, build graphical representations of data, conduct univariate and multivariate analyses, and compare data from separate sets. That was all very difficult to do by hand, but computers made it a lot easier. Quantitative research also brought with it a certain amount of rigor and mechanical precision that fit quite well in a corporate world obsessed with financial statistics and growth measures, which were also made more readily available by the same technologies that were fueling quantitative research. And since quantitative decision-making was fast becoming a discipline in business school curriculum, qualitative research started to feel dated and less reliable and credible as a result. And in fact, in my story that I've been telling you, the lawyer that is in the story would have actually come up in this way of thinking, where qualitative research was definitely not something that you could trust. By the mid-1990s, however, qualitative research swung back as researchers began to adapt their techniques to computerized approaches, and focus groups in particular became a much more accepted and widely used element of research in many disciplines. This is also kind of the time that many focus group facilities started sprouting up everywhere as marketing research firms all tried to get in the research facility business. There was a lot of interest in them. They were being done in industries that had never done them before, and as a result, you had this just huge influx of facilities, many of which are out of business now. The early 2000s swung back to a focus on quantitative research as digital technology allowed for a rise in online surveys and automated data collection tools such as CRM systems. Many research firms consolidated through mergers and acquisitions, and qualitative research shifted to focus on more experimental methods, including a number of new online techniques, many of which have kind of faded, but they're still around. And as big data became a big problem for the corporate world, the pendulum is swinging back to place a greater emphasis on adding qualitative research into large studies as a valuable component of a body of research. So they have all this quantitative analysis. Now they want to know what it means. They turn back to qualitative research. There's also been a huge rise in what we call hybrid or qual-quant or mixed mode research, where both qual and quant methods are used in the same research design. And in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say many of you, if you are in the MMR program and doing an internship, have participated in designing mixed mode or hybrid studies. It's just getting to be much more common. Then in our final week of class, we'll talk about the future of qualitative research and what I envision it'll look like in 10 or 20 years. But for now, know this. Qualitative and quantitative methods are converging to some degree, and in the course of your careers, you're going to be required to be familiar with both, because really, they're two sides of the same coin. Both qualitative and quantitative research have, as long-lost twins, since discovered each other, and after some initial conflict in realizing how different they are on the surface, they've come to realize that deep down, they're ultimately both methods of inquiry searching for truth. Their approaches are different, and the intent behind them they're hoping to uncover can greatly shape the perspective that they have to offer, but they're not so different deep down, and they can even appear to be the same thing when they're standing beside each other. And in fact, here's a breakdown of how qualitative and quantitative are different, but in some ways they really are the same. For example, qualitative tends to be focused more on individual response. It tends to be used primarily to achieve a depth of understanding. It often tends to be less structured in its lines of questioning or its lines of inquiry, and the results can be more interpretive than based on kind of predetermined criteria. Quantitative, as we know, are focused on sample or population level data. They're used primarily to generate statistics. Quantitative approaches often are highly structured, and the results generally rely on statistical analysis. Also, I would add that qualitative methods are generally much more varied. They're much more able to incorporate different kinds of data and different kinds of questioning, whereas quantitative tends to be very survey focused. It's not always, but it tends to be very survey focused. The thing is, there is some intersection between these two, and I would challenge you, as we're thinking through this course, to think about what is the difference really between a qualitative individual in-depth interview and a quantitative survey that asks a lot of deep questions. And really, where that intersection lies, qual and quant can kind of seem very similar to each other, and the main difference just is in how the questions are structured. But there's another word that I would also say makes them really different from each other in some ways, and that is intent. And that's honestly really the heart of what makes them different. When I'm teaching marketing research basics to undergraduates or to client organizations, what I often tell them is this. The word quantitative has an N in it, and that N stands for numbers. When you conduct quantitative research, it's because you want to be able to express your idea in numerical, statistical fashion to to describe a group of people, either a sample or a population. The word qualitative, though, has an L, and that L stands for listening. When you conduct qualitative research, it's because you want to listen to what individuals have to say and get a better understanding of their perspective. You'll express that information in terms of how commonly you heard themes, but not with mathematical precision. In other words, if you interview 30 people and 7 of them tell you something, you're not going to say 7 out of 30 spoke this way. If you do, you're misinterpreting your qualitative research. What you're going to say is some people said this, and then you're going to express what it was that they said that was common. That intent is really important to understand. What you want to do with the data largely shapes whether or not a study is going to be qualitative or quantitative. And as someone who conducts a lot of both, let me tell you that much of the time, the word qualitative is used to describe anything that's open-ended, and the word quantitative is used to describe anything that's scaled. Well, we're going to talk about why that's maybe not appropriate and why there's more behind the intent than just whether or not a question is open-ended or not. But the intent behind the kind of data that you want to collect and how you want to present it and how you want to use it does kind of shape which of these terms you're going to use to describe the study that you do. Now, while qualitative data tend to be more focused on direction than magnitude, the intent of qualitative research is really about depth and understanding. One way to think about the difference between how an accountant and an artist would see a jar of jelly beans kind of gives you an idea of how qualitative and quantitative researchers think a little bit differently. Okay, so if you had an accountant that was looking at this jar of jelly beans right here, the accountant might be curious about how many jelly beans are inside, or how many different colors are represented, or what the ratio of colors to beans was, or any number of kind of numerical classifications that would ultimately result in ratios and understanding. An artist, though, might be interested in what the jar of jelly beans communicates in its form and its function, how the colors interact, or how the interplay of light and shadow change the appearance of the beans. I mean, look at this picture right here. You have this nice glare right here from the light, either from the camera or from the overhead light. Some of the beans have really cool looking textures because of the way the light's reflecting off them. Some of them reflect light in different ways because of their coloring. This one has a nice long light, whereas this one has a sharp point. That's kind of how an artist would start to think about these things. Both of them are seeing the same object or the same group of objects, but thinking about the situation differently. And that's really how qualitative and quantitative researchers tend to think. Artist and accountant is a very good way of thinking about them. Now, one final note is that skeptics of qualitative research are often guilty of using a tired old saying to try to deflate it. What they'll say is, the plural of anecdotal evidence is not data. And they'll say that because qualitative research tends to go out and collect a bunch of anecdotes and then come back and report them as if they are a consistent data set. So in other words, if 5 people tell you the same anecdote, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And while that's a good principle, the problem is that 5 people telling you something does have meaning as a set of data. It just doesn't have any inherent credibility unless you investigate the source of their information and how they came to acquire it. Individuals speaking about their own experiences and perceptions are somewhat credible. Individuals who are speaking about something that they heard or think that they know are less credible, and then they require some vetting. And a classic example would be if 5 people tell you they saw a flying saucer fly overhead. Well, you know what? 5 people all agree that they saw something. That is data. It's just the data don't necessarily lead to the conclusion that they actually saw a flying saucer. The problem isn't with the data, it's with the design and how those data were collected. Now, we're going to work hard in this class to avoid bad qualitative design that leads to anecdotal evidence, but we're also going to learn how to use anecdotes properly to help to make a point that explains research in a little bit better fashion than maybe quantitative is capable of doing. With that said, I'm going to close out this lecture and move on to our next one by asking you a question that I hope you're going to find a little bit puzzling, although maybe you'll have some thoughts on it. How are qualitative and quantitative research like Batman and Superman? Now, I'll give you the answer to that in the next lecture.